The first time I saw its tracks, I almost convinced myself I hadn't. That is the God's honest truth of how this started. Not with a sighting, not with a scream in the dark. Just a set of prints pressed into the black mud along the eastern bank of Linden Creek, deep in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin. It was the third week of October, the kind of cold that smells like iron and dead leaves, and I was 4 miles from my truck doing a routine deer kill assessment after a car strike report from the county road. The tracks were there in the mud like they had always been there. Like they were waiting for me specifically. 2 feet, not 4, 2. Bipedal. Each impression roughly 11 inches long, 5 inches across at the ball, with 4 pronounced toe depressions showing claw drag behind each pad. The stride length was 51 inches. I measured it twice with the tape I kept on my belt. 51 inches between footfalls. I am 6 feet tall, and my walking stride is 30 inches. Whatever left those prints was covering more ground per step than I could manage at a dead run. I stood there for what felt like a long time. The forest was completely still. Not wind still, not winter quiet. Deliberately, heavily, pressingly silent, in a way that forests are not silent when you are alone in them. I was not alone. I knew it then the same way I knew anything in 31 years of working those woods. The way you know a change in pressure before a storm. Not thought, not deduction. Bone-deep knowing. I photographed the tracks with the disposable camera I kept in my jacket pocket. I wrote down the measurements in my field notebook. Then I walked back to my truck and did not file a report. That was the first decision. That was where everything started, and I have been living with it ever since. My name is Dale Kowalski. I am 67 years old as of this past February, and I am telling you this now because I do not have the luxury of waiting any longer. My cardiologist used the phrase structural compromise at my last appointment. That is doctor language for the clock is running. I have outlasted 2 marriages, 1 war, and 31 years of a career that the state of Wisconsin paid me reasonably well to pretend was ordinary. What I'm about to tell you is not ordinary. I kept it locked inside me for 11 years while I was still active, and for another 4 years after I retired, and the weight of it has become the kind of weight that eventually either gets set down or buries you. I am setting it down, right here, right now, for you. Whoever you are watching this on your phone or your computer or whatever device the young people use these days. I do not fully understand how this platform works. My neighbor's daughter helped me set up this account, and she explained the thumbnail thing to me twice, and I still could not tell you what a thumbnail is. The algorithm gods that apparently decide whether anyone hears this story are not something I can control, so I am just going to trust them and start talking. I would appreciate it if the YouTube police do not take this down before I finish. I promise it gets worse before it gets better. That is not a threat. That is just the shape of this particular story. The October tracks were the beginning, but the story I need to tell you starts in late March of 2002, 7 months before those prints appeared. That matters. That context matters, because by October I was already a different man than I had been in March, and the creature found that man, not the one I used to be. I need you to understand the field before I put the crop in the ground. I had been a game warden with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources for 19 years by March of 2002. Linden District, 43,000 acres of mixed hardwood and boreal forest, 4 major creek systems, 2 state campgrounds, 11 miles of unmarked logging roads, and a total of maybe 200 permanent residents within the patrol boundaries. It was not glamorous work. Most of it was paperwork and deer stand disputes and pulling illegally set traps, and occasionally dealing with a drunk ice fisherman who had wandered onto private land. I loved it. I loved it the way you love something when it fits the exact shape of who you are. Quiet work in a loud world, solitary without being lonely. Or, that is what I told myself. The marriage had ended 18 months before. Karen left in September of 2000. She was not wrong to go. I was there in body and gone in every other sense that matters. The job was the marriage, and she knew it before I did. We had no children. That was a mutual grief that neither of us was ever honest about. After she left, I moved into the district cabin full-time. It was a DNR property, 1 room and a sleeping loft. Set back 400 yards from State Route 17 on a 2-track gravel road surrounded by white pine and red maple. I had a wood stove and a hand pump well and a propane cook stove, and I was comfortable in the way a man gets comfortable when he stops expecting company. That was where I was living in March of 2002, when a late-season blizzard dropped 22 inches on the district in 36 hours, and the forest went suddenly, terribly quiet in the aftermath. The day after the storm, I drove the logging roads to check for downed trees blocking access corridors. It was a Tuesday, March 19th. The light was that particular blue-white that comes off deep snow when the sky is clear, almost painful to look at without sunglasses. I found the first one about 2 miles up the Kettle Creek spur road. A young male, I estimated, though the condition made that difficult to determine precisely. It was lying in the snow on the east side of the road, partway beneath a fallen birch. At first, I thought it was a large dog, some domestic animal that had gotten loose in the storm and succumbed to exposure. Then I got out of the truck and walked closer, and I stopped about 10 feet away, and I just looked. It was not a dog. The proportions were wrong in ways I could not immediately articulate. The skull was too large, the jaw too pronounced. The shoulder blades sat too high, almost like a wolf's, but the chest was broad and flat in a way a wolf's is not. The forelimbs were long, too long relative to the torso. The fur was dark brown, nearly black along the spine, lightening to a rust color along the flanks. It was breathing, shallow, wet, labored breathing that I could hear from 10 feet away in the post-storm silence. It was alive. It was a juvenile, I realized. Maybe 8 months old, possibly less. Whatever it was, it had not survived its first major winter storm on its own. It was dying. I have never in my career been a man who intervenes in natural processes. That is not what the job is. That is not what the forest requires. But I was standing there in the blue-white silence looking at something breathing its last breath that should not have existed at all, and I made a decision that defied everything I knew about good judgment. I picked it up. It weighed 43 pounds. It did not fight me. That is the thing I still turn over in my mind when I think about those first moments. It did not fight me. A wild animal in distress fights. It bites, it claws, it panics. This one turned its head and looked at me with eyes that were amber at the outer ring and deepening to a dark honey near the pupil. And it made a sound. Not a growl, not a whimper, something in between. Something that registered low in my chest rather than in my ears. I carried it to the truck. I wrapped it in the emergency wool blanket I kept behind the seat. I drove it back to the cabin, and somewhere along that 4-mile drive, still not fully knowing what it was, I decided I was not going to report it. Not to the DNR, not to anyone. That was the second decision, and unlike the first one, which I made out of scientific caution, this one I made out of something I am less proud to name. Loneliness. Simple, stupid, bottomless loneliness. I was 56 years old, alone in a 1-room cabin in a district no one else wanted, and something impossible had looked at me with amber eyes and let me carry it. I was not strong enough to put it back in the snow. I spent the first 3 days convinced it was going to die. I had no veterinary training beyond standard field first aid for large mammals. I improvised. I kept it warm near the wood stove. Wrapped in that wool blanket on a folded piece of tarpaulin, I laid on the floor. I gave it water from a syringe every 2 hours. On the second day, I tried raw venison from a piece of shoulder meat I had in the freezer from the previous fall. It ate. Slow and deliberate, pulling the meat apart with a precision that unnerved me, because it was not the tearing and gulping of a starved animal. It ate the way something eats when it is deciding whether it trusts you enough to need you. By the 4th day, it was standing on its own. By the 7th day, it had identified the highest point in the one-room cabin, which was the top of the wooden shelf unit beside the back window, and it had claimed it. It would sit up there for hours, watching me. Not nervously, not defensively, with a kind of focused, deliberate attention that felt more like assessment than fear. I started talking to it. Not because I thought it understood me, because the silence in the cabin had become something I could feel on my skin, and I had to put something against it. I said things like, "You need a name, and I hope you know what you are, because I sure don't, and you are going to be trouble, aren't you?" That last one I said on the 9th day, looking up at it on the shelf, and it lowered its head and made that chest felt sound again. I took that as a yes. I named it Ezra. It came to me in the middle of the 2nd week, reading by the wood stove. Ezra, the scribe, the one who wrote down what he saw without apology. It felt right. It felt like the name of something that had survived something it should not have survived and intended to testify about it. I told it the name out loud, sitting in the chair across from the shelf. "Ezra," I said, "that is your name." It turned its amber eyes directly at me and was still for a long moment. Then it stepped down from the shelf for the first time since it had claimed it, crossed the 8 feet of plank floor between us, and lay down with its side pressed against my leg. That was the 3rd decision. The first was not reporting the tracks. The second was bringing it inside. The third was naming it. I understand now that each one closed a door, and once a door is closed in that forest, it does not open again. I did not find the second one until late April, 6 weeks after Ezra came inside and took up residence against my left leg every evening. The snow had receded enough that the creek banks were clear, and I was walking the Linden Creek drainage as a part of a spring survey. I almost missed it entirely. It was wedged into the hollow of a downed cedar, about 3 feet in, curled in on itself with its nose tucked under its tail. Smaller than Ezra had been. Darker. Nearly black all over, with a gray-silver dusting along the muzzle that made it look older than it was. When I crouched down and looked in, it looked back at me. Alert. Not frightened, just watching. Same amber eyes, same deliberate quality of attention. I knew immediately it was related to Ezra. The skull shape was identical. The shoulder proportions, the depth of the chest. This was the same species, the same impossible, undocumented, shouldn't-be-here species. I sat back on my heels in the damp April leaves and breathed. Then I looked into the hollow again and said, "Well, I suppose you had better come too." I named this one Miriam. Not immediately. Miriam came 3 days later, when I watched her arrange 12 small stones near the base of the shelf unit in a shape I could not explain. She moved each stone with careful deliberation, examined each placement, moved 2 of them twice. Then she sat back and looked at the arrangement as though checking her work. Miriam, the prophetess, the one who understood patterns before anyone else did. It fit her the way names fit things that are already themselves. From the beginning, they were different. Ezra was larger, bolder, quicker to physicality. When something interested him, he went at it directly. He would stand at the window on his hind legs to look outside, forelimbs braced against the frame, head tilted. He was not aggressive, but he was dominant in the way large animals are dominant, through the weight of his presence rather than any overt act. Miriam moved differently, quieter, more deliberate. She studied things for a long time before she engaged with them, including me. It took her 3 weeks to allow me to touch her. But when she finally allowed it, she turned her head into my hand with a pressure that was almost heartbreaking in its trust. She smelled like cold earth and pine resin. She always smelled like cold earth and pine resin regardless of season or weather. I do not know how to explain that except to say that some things carry their nature in their scent, and hers was the deep cold of the forest floor, where the sun never fully reaches. By the end of April, they were both sleeping in the cabin. By the end of May, Ezra had taken to following me on foot during my morning perimeter walks, keeping 20 feet behind me in the tree line. I would not see him, but I would know. The birds knew. The forest has a different quality of silence when something large is moving through it. I learned to read that silence. I learned to know when it was Ezra and when it was something else. That distinction would matter later. I didn't know that yet. There was a flat piece of granite near the bend in Linden Creek, roughly 18 inches across, smooth and slightly concave in the center, sitting on the east bank where the light came through a gap in the canopy in the late morning. I started leaving food there. Not as bait, not as a training behavior. I started leaving it there because Ezra found the rock in early June of 2002 and spent an entire morning lying on it with his eyes closed in the first real warmth of summer. And I sat on the bank 10 feet away with my coffee and my notebook, and we were two creatures in the sun doing nothing in particular, and it was the most peaceful morning I had experienced in years. After that, the rock became ours. I would leave a piece of dried meat or a fish on the rock when I passed in the morning. By August, Miriam had started leaving things on the rock too. A crow feather. Once, a piece of rusted metal I recognized as the bracket from a deer stand that had blown down 2 winters before, collected from a site half a mile upstream. I do not know why she brought those things. I chose not to analyze it. I simply took what she left and kept it. By the end of that first summer, I had a coffee tin on the windowsill with a crow feather, the bracket, 3 river stones with unusual banding, and a fragment of antler velvet. Miriam's collection. Left on the granite rock by the creek bend, the only place on earth that belonged to all 3 of us. That summer I learned what they ate. Deer, primarily, white-tailed deer. They took them cleanly and entirely, leaving almost nothing. I found 2 kill sites in my district that summer that I would have flagged for a wolf investigation if I did not know what had made them. The bites were too large. The bone damage too substantial. I wrote them up as probable large canid activity, undetermined. That was the first lie I put in an official report. It was not the last. I told myself it was a sin of omission, not commission. I understand now that the distinction matters less than I wanted it to. I was protecting them. That is the truth I would not say plainly even to myself then. I was protecting something I loved because I loved it, and the job I had done honestly for 19 years became the vehicle I used to keep the secret. That is the part I have to live with. The second year, 2003. By then, they had outgrown the cabin, which in retrospect I should have foreseen. Ezra's weight by that spring was close to 220 pounds. I estimated it because I could not put him on a scale, but I had been assessing large mammals by weight my entire career, and I trust my eye. He was somewhere between 7 and 7.5 feet when he stood fully upright, which he did more and more as he matured. Miriam was smaller. 160 pounds, perhaps a few more. 6.5 feet standing. The cabin was 1 room. By May, they had shifted to sleeping in the covered lean-to wood storage structure attached to the north wall of the cabin. I did not force this. They chose it. I reinforced the structure over a long weekend in April, added 2 walls of salvaged plywood, put in a second-hand metal roof panel over the existing rotting cedar shakes, and installed a heavy plank door with an iron latch. I cut a low opening in the back wall, roughly 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall, that let them access the adjacent woods without going around the cabin. I told anyone who asked that I was adding a proper woodshed. Nobody asked. Nobody came out to the cabin anyway. This was in my favor, and I knew it, and I used it deliberately. The isolation that had always been a matter of temperament became, from 2003 onward, a matter of strategy. They had routines. I want you to understand that. Ezra and Miriam had daily routines with the specificity and consistency of domestic animals. Ezra was awake and active at first light. I would hear him moving in the lean-to before my alarm, the soft, heavy tread of him crossing the plank floor, the creak of the back access as he went out into the pre-dawn woods. He was back by mid-morning, usually, sometimes with evidence of a successful hunt, which he consistently deposited at the back of the lean-to rather than bringing inside. He seemed to understand, without being taught, that certain things did not belong indoors. Miriam's mornings were slower. She rose later, took more time. She had developed a habit of sitting at the lean-to entrance facing east for 20 or 30 minutes before she ate or moved. Just sitting, watching the tree line. In the early months, I assumed this was some kind of threat monitoring behavior, an animal checking its environment before committing to a position. By the second year, I was less certain. It had the quality of deliberateness you associate with contemplation. I know how that sounds. I am telling you what I observed. The practical problems of that second year were considerable, and I want to be honest about them because they are part of how real this was. Feeding 2 large predators in a district where I was also responsible for ungulate population management required a level of logistical choreography that I did not fully anticipate. Deer were the primary source, but I supplemented with elk offcuts I sourced from a meat processor 2 counties over, driving the distance in my personal truck on days off, so no department vehicle mileage record could be questioned. I paid cash. In 2003 alone, I spent over $4,000 of my own money on supplemental food. I did not have $4,000 to spare. I had a state pension accumulating, a savings account that Karen had left reasonably intact after the divorce settlement, and the cabin costs were DNR covered. But $4,000 is $4,000, and by October of that year I was eating canned soup most nights of the week and telling myself I was watching my cholesterol. I was not watching my cholesterol. I was feeding something that had no business existing in that forest, and I was doing it willingly, and the sacrifice felt less like burden than obligation. That is worth noting. The sacrifice felt like the right use of the resources I had. Looking back, I understand that this is how people lose themselves to a thing. Not through coercion, through the quiet arithmetic of choosing it, again and again, until the choosing becomes identity. In late July of 2003, Miriam brought something to the granite rock that was different from her usual offerings. It was a pine knot, a dense, heavy knot from a white pine, the kind that form where a large branch separates from the trunk. This one was roughly the size of a grapefruit, dense and resinous, amber colored at its center where the grain spiraled. She set it precisely in the center of the rock's concave depression and stepped back. I found it on my morning walk. I stood looking at it for a long time. The pine knot was not a random object. I had a pine knot on my desk in the cabin, had it there since I moved in, years before she arrived. I had picked it up on a walk in my second year in the district because of the way the grain moved inside it, the way it looked like it was always in the process of becoming something. I had never noticed her paying attention to it, but she had found its mirror in the forest and brought it to the place that was ours. I carried it home and set it beside the first one on the windowsill and did not sleep well that night. Not from fear, from the opposite of fear, from the dread of something beautiful that you know you cannot keep. 2004 brought the first summer without a major incident, and I mean that the way you say it about something valuable, measured in the absence of crisis. The pair had settled into the district with a competence that was remarkable. They were not reckless. They moved deep in the forest during daylight hours when human activity was highest. They came closer to the cabin after dark. They had developed what I could only describe as territorial boundaries, a roughly 4-mile radius from the cabin that they monitored with regularity. Within that area, I stopped finding any sign of coyotes, which had been numerous when I arrived. I also stopped finding fox kills that bore the signature of other large predators. The district's deer population stabilized. I noted in my official reports that predation pressure from probable wolf activity had created a more balanced ungulate population in the eastern survey areas. The department cited those numbers in a regional management report that year. I read my own fraudulent data being quoted back to me by bureaucrats who had never walked those woods, and I felt something I can only describe as a cold, specific shame that did not prevent me from doing it again the following year. I want to tell you about the first time I was truly afraid of Ezra, because the fear matters. The fear is not a footnote. It is part of the story, and you need to feel it the way I did, arriving from a direction I did not expect. It was September of 2004, a warm evening, still enough light to read by. I had the lean-to door open, and I was sitting in the camp chair I kept just inside the entrance, writing my field notes. Ezra came back from the woods earlier than usual. His pace was different, tighter. He came through the back access and crossed the lean-to and sat down 2 feet in front of me, and I could feel him before I looked up. That is the only way I can describe it. A pressure in the air between us. A charge. I looked up from the notebook. His eyes were not the warm amber I knew. They were bright, too bright. Hard and fixed on something slightly to my left, not on my face. I turned slowly. There was nothing there. Just the plank wall. I turned back and sat very still and looked at him and breathed carefully and said quietly, "Whatever it is, let it go." He was still for a long moment. The charging quality in the air held. Then he exhaled. A long, slow breath that I felt against my hands. His eyes softened. He settled. He lowered his big head onto his forelimbs and lay down 3 feet from my chair and went to sleep as though nothing had happened. I sat there for another hour in the dark that came in around us, not writing, not reading, just sitting with the understanding that whatever Ezra was, he was also something I was not fully in possession of. That he had depths I could not see. That the gentleness he showed me was not the whole of what he was. I should have understood then that the distance between the two was going to grow. Looking back, I can see it as clearly as a line on a map. I could not see it then. 2005. The 3rd year. The year Miriam first let me hear her sing. I do not know what else to call it. It was winter. Early February, hard cold, -14 at 6 in the morning. I was awake before dawn making coffee when I heard it through the cabin wall. Not the chest-felt resonance of the warning sound I knew. Something higher. Complex. Structured. Intervals and returns. The way music has intervals and returns, not the way animal calls do. I stood at the wood stove, holding my cup for 2 full minutes listening. Then I put on my coat and boots and went to the lean-to door and opened it. She was sitting in the access opening facing the forest. The half-dark was blue and absolute around her. She was looking up at a gap in the canopy where the stars were still visible. She did not turn when I opened the door. She kept singing. 3 or 4 distinct repeated figures, interlocking, rising at the end of each return. I stood in the doorway in the -14 cold and listened until she stopped, which was about 4 minutes later. She turned then and looked at me. That specific quality of looking she had. Assessment. The amber eyes in the pre-dawn blue. Then she got up and walked past me into the lean-to and lay down and went back to sleep. I closed the door and went inside and stood at the wood stove for a long time. I did not write it in the field notes. Some things you do not write down because writing them makes them too real, and you are afraid of what real means for them. That same winter, January of 2005, a DNR contractor came through the district doing a routine infrastructure assessment on the logging access roads. His name was Breckett, a civil engineer out of Wosow who drove a white pickup and wore a day-glow vest and had the aggressive cheerfulness of someone being paid by the hour to be outdoors. He asked to use the cabin as a base for 2 days while he documented the northern corridor. I said yes because refusing would have been unusual. I spent those 2 days with a specific, managed dread running continuously underneath every conversation, every cup of coffee I offered him, every map I spread on the table. Ezra and Miriam did not come near the cabin during that period, not once. No sound from the lean-to, no tracks in the snow around the clearing. I do not know how they knew. But they knew, and they stayed away. And on the morning Breckett packed his truck and drove south, I stood on the cabin step in the snow and breathed out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 48 hours. That evening, Miriam came back first. She walked across the clearing in the late light, crossed to the lean-to access, and paused at the door. She turned and looked at me on the step, then she went inside. Ezra was back by midnight. I heard his weight settle onto the lean-to floor through the cabin wall, and I slept better than I had in 2 days. The knowledge that they had understood the danger without being told was, I realize now, the moment I stopped thinking of them as animals I was protecting and started thinking of them as something I was in a relationship with. That distinction is not a small one. That distinction is the architecture of everything that followed. By 2006, I had been living this way for 4 years. Double life is the wrong phrase because it implies 2 separate existences running in parallel. What I had was one life with a hidden room inside it. Every professional decision I made was filtered through the question of how it protected the room. I declined several requests for district reassignment that would have been promotions. I managed my patrol routes to maximize coverage of the areas where Ezra and Miriam operated. I cultivated a professional reputation for meticulous record-keeping that made my reports credible and therefore unquestioned. I was a good warden. That is something I can still say without irony. I was a good warden who was also conducting the largest and most sustained cover-up in the history of the department's Linden district. I do not offer that as a confession I expect forgiveness for. I offer it as the context you need to understand what the next 5 years cost me. 2006 was also the year I began to hear things at the northern edge of the patrol district that I could not account for with what I knew. Sounds at night, 2 miles and more from the cabin, in the deepest section of the forest where the logging roads dead-ended and the survey coverage was thinnest. A sound like Miriam's singing, but lower and less structured. Shorter, more like a signal than a song. I heard it first on a late November evening, walking the Kettle Creek extension at dusk. I stopped and stood for 6 minutes with my hand on the tree beside me, listening. It did not repeat. I walked out in the dark and did not sleep well. I heard it twice more before the spring thaw, each time from the same general direction, each time failing to repeat before I could triangulate. I mentioned nothing in my reports. I increased my patrols of the northern corridor. I told myself it was echoing geography distorting sounds from the creek. I convinced myself this with the specific determination of a man who does not want to know what he already suspects, that there was something else out there, that Ezra and Miriam were not the only ones, that the world I thought I was managing was larger and older and less interested in being managed than I had let myself believe. In March of 2007, I found the pine knot was gone from the granite rock. I had been leaving it there in summer, through a habit I could not explain, sometimes placing it in the concave center for an hour on my morning walk, and then bringing it back to the cabin. The morning I found it gone, the snow was 4 inches fresh on the rock. There were prints in the snow at the rock's edge. Not Ezra's, not Miriam's. I had spent 5 years learning their prints with the precision of a man whose livelihood depended on reading tracks. These were neither. Slightly narrower across the ball of the foot. The claw drag pattern at a different angle. A different animal had stood at our rock in the night, had found the pine knot, had taken it or moved it. I searched the bank both directions and found no other sign. The knot was simply gone. When Miriam came back to the lean-to at midday, I watched her. She ate. She arranged 3 stones near the back wall. She gave no sign that anything had changed. But that evening, when Ezra returned from the forest, the 2 of them went into the back access together and stood there for a long time, side by side, looking north. Not moving, not making any sound, just standing and looking north into the dark. I watched them from the cabin window with the lights off, and I understood that something had shifted, that there was a communication happening that I was not part of and was never going to be part of. The pine knot did not come back to the rock. That was the first time I felt, clearly and without the comfort of self-deception, that I was going to lose them. I spent the spring of 2007 expanding my northern patrol routes in a way that had no official justification. I added 2 new weekly passes through the Kettle Creek Headwater Basin, which was technically outside my primary survey area, and required a memo I filed with Hargrove explaining it as proactive spring flood impact monitoring. That was another lie. I was tracking. I was documenting every print, every disturbed section of bank, every snapped branch at the height a large biped would produce at the shoulder when passing through dense brush. I kept a second field notebook, separate from my official record, that I stored in a waterproof bag under the floorboards of the cabin. That notebook has 23 pages of measurements, sketches, and observations from the 2007 Northern Extension patrols. I still have it. I have looked at it twice since retiring. Both times I put it back under the floorboards of the Mercer house because some records are not meant for cabinets. By July, I had documented evidence of at least 2 distinct individuals using the northern corridor on a regular basis. Not Ezra, not Miriam, others. Moving south and then north again, never staying, never coming close to the cabin. Passing through, the way a person passes through a neighborhood they are checking on rather than settling into. I wrote transient activity, northern corridor in the private notebook. Then I closed it and drove home, and sat with the 2 pine knots on the table, and did not say out loud what I had begun to understand, which was that the world my 2 belonged to had been patient and was becoming less so. 2008, 4.5 years in. Ezra was 6 years old by my best estimate, and the changes in him had been accumulating for 2 years, in ways I had been documenting without letting myself read the total they added up to. He was bigger. He had reached his full size by 2006, somewhere between 250 and 280 pounds. His manner had changed more than his size. The deliberateness that had always characterized him had become something harder, more territorial. He began marking the northern boundary of his range with increasing frequency and intensity. I found his sign there twice a week, where I had found it once a month the year before. In July of 2008, he tore apart a tree, not scratched it, tore a section of standing dead birch, roughly 8 inches in diameter, apart with his forelimbs. I found the debris on my morning patrol and stood looking at the scattered pieces of wood and felt my body register something my brain was slow to process. That was not play behavior. That was not territorial marking. That was a display of force directed at something. I never saw the something, but the something was out there in those northern woods, and Ezra knew it, and whatever message he was sending, the intensity of it was escalating. In November of 2008, I arrived at the cabin after a 2-day patrol to find the lean-to door had been forced, not broken. The iron latch was bent outward, a 2-inch deflection of 1/4-inch iron from the inside. From a blow struck from within. Miriam was inside the lean-to in the far corner, pressed against the back wall. Ezra was gone. There was blood on the plank floor, not a large amount. A dark smear from the access opening to the space near the door. Miriam's eyes when I came in were that hard bright quality I had seen in Ezra 4 years before, but in her it looked different. It looked like grief wearing the mask of alert. I sat down on the floor beside her. I said, "Tell me what happened." I said it the way you speak to someone who you know cannot answer, and you are speaking for yourself, for the act of not being silent in the face of something terrible. She lowered her head onto my leg. She was trembling. Not the fine trembling of cold, the slow, deep trembling of an animal that has been frightened to its core and is not yet out of it. Ezra came back 3 days later. He was not injured. He gave no sign that anything was different. But from that November he slept outside the lean-to, at the edge of the tree line, facing north. Always facing north. Always. I told myself he had taken on a guardian role. I told myself it was protective behavior. I was lying to myself with both hands, and I knew it. 2009. Year 7. The year the visits from the northern sounds became something I could no longer categorize as echoes or imagination. In April, I found a full set of tracks in the mud of the Kettle Creek extension heading south. A single individual, bipedal, 12-inch length. The stride was 58 inches, which was Ezra's length when he was moving fast. This was not Ezra. This was something of similar size moving at a controlled walk through my district during daylight hours and heading toward the cabin. I followed the tracks for 3/4 of a mile before they turned east into the dense second growth and disappeared. I stood at the place where they ended and looked into the trees and did not see anything and heard nothing. The silence was the deliberate kind. I was being watched and I knew it. I went back to the cabin. I did not sleep well for the next 6 weeks. Ezra's behavior during this period was extreme. He ranged farther. He came back to the cabin less frequently. There were days, then stretches of 2 and 3 days, when I did not see him at all. Each time he returned, there was a quality about him I can only describe as coiled, like a thing under pressure waiting for release. Miriam moved closer to the cabin. She stopped going to the granite rock. She stopped making her deliberate stone arrangements. She spent long hours in the lean-to with the door half open, looking out, and the quality of her looking was vigilance rather than contemplation. In June of 2009, on a clear evening with the light going gold through the pine trunks at about 8 o'clock, I was sitting on the step of the cabin eating from a can when I saw something at the tree line, 130 feet from where I sat. It stood in the shadow of 2 large red maples at the edge of the clearing. It was bipedal, it was large, it was not Ezra. The proportions were slightly different, the stance was different. Where Ezra's posture had a quality of forward momentum even when still, this creature was perfectly, absolutely, preternaturally still. I could see the amber catch of its eyes in the tree-line shadow. We looked at each other for 40 seconds. I counted them. I did not move. It did not move. Then it stepped back into the trees and was gone. Not gone in the way things go when they turn and leave. Gone in the way things go when they were always too deep in the dark for you to really see them. I sat on the step with the can in my hands and listened to my heart doing something irregular and unpleasant in my chest, and I thought very clearly, without alarm, that I had been naive in a way I could not afford to be naive any longer. There was a community out there in those northern woods, not two, more than two, and my two had always been part of it in ways I had not understood and had not been meant to understand. I was not their keeper. I had never been their keeper. I had been, at most, a rest stop on a longer journey that was never mine to direct. I went back inside that evening and I looked at the 2 pine knots on the windowsill. I looked at the coffee tin beside them with its crow feather and river stones and antler velvet and rusted bracket. 7 years of objects, 7 years of accumulated proof that something had passed between us that did not have a category in any field manual I had ever read or written. I thought about what it meant that something had been watching the cabin. Watching me. Not as a threat assessment. There was no aggression in that stillness at the tree line. It was something closer to the way you look at a thing that belongs to someone you know. Something you have heard about, and are now seeing for yourself. I had the unshakable feeling that whatever stood at the tree line had been told about me, not warned about me. Told about me the way you tell someone about a person they have not met but should know exists. I cannot prove that. I will not try to prove it. But I was a man who had read forest sign professionally for over 2 decades, and I trusted my reading of that moment the way I trusted my reading of tracks and scat and territorial markers. Something knew I was there. Something had made a judgment about me, and had not found me wanting. That knowledge was the most frightening and the most consoling thing I had felt in years. 2010, year 8. I turned 64 in February. My knees had gotten worse, and I'd started taking anti-inflammatories every morning before my patrol. The department had offered me a desk position in the regional office twice in the past 3 years, and I had declined both times with polite bureaucratic language that masked the truth, which was that leaving the district was not something I was capable of yet. My supervisor, a decent man named Hargrove, who had given me less grief over the years than I deserved, told me at my annual review that I was the most overqualified warden in the northern region, and that my district stats were consistently the best in the sector, and that he was not going to force me to move, but that I should think about my health. I told him my health was fine. I was lying about my health the way I was lying about everything else connected to those woods. The anti-inflammatories were for the knees, and also for a shoulder I had injured falling on ice in January, and my cardiologist had told me in December to reduce my physical workload, and I had nodded and smiled and kept doing what I was doing. I want to be plain about this because it matters to the shape of what came next. I was not a well man by 2010. I was a stubborn old man who had organized his entire life around a secret and could not see how to exist outside of it. The spring of 2010 was when Miriam found the 2nd pine knot. I was watching from the cabin window when she came back from the forest in early May, carrying something. She crossed the clearing, went to the granite rock at the creek bend and set it down. I walked out 20 minutes later and stood looking. It was a pine knot nearly identical to the first one. Same size, same amber resin at the grain spiral, same dense weight when I picked it up. I turned it in my hands. I looked upstream and downstream and saw nothing. I looked at the rock and at the smooth water running past it, and at the gap in the canopy where the light came through. I thought about 5 years of objects collected on this rock and what each one had meant, and what the collected weight of all of them amounted to. I set the knot in the center of the concavity. I sat down on the bank. I put my hands on my knees and felt the ache in them and the ache below that in the larger sense of a life getting toward its end, and I let myself feel, for the first time, clearly and without deflection, that I was going to be alone when this was over. Whatever was coming, whatever the presence in the northern woods signified, whatever the growing coiled quality in Ezra pointed toward. When it arrived, I was going to be standing on this bank with a coffee tin of crow feathers and river stones, and they were going to be gone, and the forest was going to return to its deliberate silence and keep what it knew to itself. I sat there for a long time. Then I picked up the pine knot and carried it back to the cabin and set it on the windowsill with everything else and went inside. 2011. Year 9. The escalation was not subtle by then. I want to be clear that by spring of 2011 there was nothing subtle about what was happening. Ezra had lost weight. 15 to 20 pounds by my estimate, which on a 260-pound animal is visible and significant. He was hunting more frequently, but eating less of each kill. He was sleeping less. He ranged constantly. The tracks I found on the northern boundary were now appearing on multiple nights a week. Multiple individuals. I could identify at least 3 distinct stride patterns in the extended sections of creek mud. 3 animals minimum monitoring his boundary from the north. I did not know their intentions. I still do not know their intentions. What I know is what I observed, which is that whatever message was being communicated across that boundary was not resolved by anything Ezra or I could do. And Miriam. Miriam was different in a way I did not want to name. She was still gentle with me. She still came to the rock. But there was a quality in her eyes some mornings when she looked at me that I can only describe as apology. The way a person looks when they have to tell you something and have not found the words yet and are not sure they are going to. The boundary incident happened on September 4th, 2011, a Tuesday. The sky had been overcast for 3 days, and the light under the canopy was flat and gray. I was on the North Patrol Road at about 4 in the afternoon when I heard the sound. Not the singing, not the chest-felt resonance. A fight. 2 large animals close, within 200 yards into the tree line to my northeast. Crashing, not the clean crash of a deer, but the sustained structural crashing of large bodies against wood and undergrowth with full force. I put the truck in park and got out and stood at the road edge. It lasted 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the truck dash through the windshield. 4 minutes is a long time for a fight between animals of that size. Then silence, the deliberate kind. I went into the trees. I found Ezra 20 yards in. He was standing. That was the first thing, he was standing, and my chest unclenched by a measure I could feel. He had injuries, long lacerations on the right shoulder and along the left side of his jaw. Not deep, deep enough to bleed. He turned and looked at me when I came through the trees. His eyes were not coiled or charged. They were something I had not seen in them for 3 years. Exhausted. Simply exhausted. I stood there in the flat gray light between the trees, and I said the only thing that came. I said, "Come home with me." He looked at me for a long time, then he turned and walked north. I watched him go until the gray forest took him. He did not look back. I have been carrying that backward glance he did not give me ever since. He came back to the cabin 7 days later. It was September 11th. I remember because the date has its own weight in the American ear regardless of context. He came back in the middle of the afternoon, which was not his way. I was on the cabin step and I saw him coming across the clearing and I stood up. He walked slower than I had ever seen him walk. He walked like something that had settled a decision and was living in the aftermath. He came to the step where I was standing, and he sat down in front of me at a distance of 3 feet, and he looked at me. I looked back. I said his name. Ezra. He made the chest sound. The one I had known since the first week, the first 9 days, when he was 43 pounds and dying in the snow. I reached out and put my hand on the top of his head between the ears, and he allowed it. Briefly. Then he stood. He turned north. He walked to the tree line. He paused there for a moment. And in that pause, in the quality of that pause, I heard it. 1 sound, 2 syllables. Not animal, not human. Both. His voice producing something that was in the space between language and instinct, a place I had not known existed until that moment. Go back. That is what it sounded like. Go back. As though he were telling me or telling himself or telling both of us the only true thing that remained to say. Then he walked into the trees. I never saw him again. Miriam stayed for 11 more days. I want to tell you about each one, but I do not fully trust my ability to do that without breaking into the kind of grief that is not useful to you or to her memory. What I can tell you is this. She slept in the lean-to every night, and every night I sat on the step in the cold until I could hear her breathing slow into sleep. And then I went inside and lay on my bunk in the dark and listened to the forest around us like a man listening to a house he knows he is about to leave. On the 3rd night after Ezra went north, she came to the cabin door. She had never done that before. She stood at the door, not scratching at it, not making any sound. Just standing. I felt it the way I had learned to feel presence in that forest, the changed quality of the air, the way the dark outside a door feels different when something living is on the other side of it. I got up and opened the door. She stood in the doorframe for a long moment. Her amber eyes were level with my face. We were that close. I could smell the cold earth and pine resin of her. She was looking at me with an expression I have spent 4 years trying to describe and cannot improve on. It was the expression of someone finishing a sentence they started a long time ago. Then she turned and went back to the lean-to. I stood in the open doorway in the September dark and let the cold come in around me and understood, without a word passing between us, that she was saying goodbye in the only language available to her. On the 5th day, she went back to the granite rock. I watched her from the tree line, keeping my distance, not wanting to change what she was doing by being seen doing it. She sat on the bank beside the rock for a long time. Not at the rock's center. At the bank beside it, the way I sat when I brought my coffee and my notebook in the early years. She sat there in the October light, the maple color coming into the trees along the creek. And she was still in that contemplative way she had always been still, the way that looked more like thought than rest. After 20 minutes, she stood. She looked at the rock. She looked upstream. She turned and walked back toward the cabin and did not look at the rock again. I followed at a distance. When she went through the lean to access, I went into the cabin and sat at the table and put my face in my hands. On the 9th day, she brought the pine knot, the second one, the one she had found in the forest in May and placed on the rock. She carried it to the cabin step and set it at my feet and looked at me, and I picked it up and held it and did not speak. I held both of them that evening, one in each hand, the first one I had carried for years before she arrived, and the second one she had found and given to me. And the weight of them together was the weight of the whole 9 years compressed into something I could hold, not because the objects were symbolic, not because I assigned meaning to them, because she had assigned meaning to them first, before I understood what she was doing, and everything I felt when I held them was her meaning moving through my hands. On the 11th day, she was gone. I filed my patrol reports that week. I noted typical fall activity in the survey areas. I closed the lean-to with a padlock I had no reason to use anymore. I drove to the regional office and told Hargrove I was taking the desk position. He looked at me for a moment with the particular look of a man who has been waiting for something and is surprised it is finally here. He said, "You sure?" I said yes. I drove back to the cabin in the dark. I sat at the wood stove with the 2 pine knots on the table in front of me and the coffee tin of collected objects on the windowsill, and I thought about the sequence of every decision I had made from March 19th of 2002 until that morning when I stood on the step of an empty cabin and smelled the cold earth and pine resin still present in the lean-to boards, already fading, and knew it would be gone by the following week and the week after that, and eventually I would not be able to call it back at all. I retired from the department the following March, 23 years with the Wisconsin DNR. My district stats were the best in the northern region for the final decade of my service. The department gave me a laminated certificate and a handshake from a deputy director I had never met. I moved into the rented house in Mercer, 18 miles south, and put the coffee tin on the kitchen windowsill and the 2 pine knots on the kitchen table, and tried to build a life in which those objects were not the primary evidence of everything that had mattered. I went back to the granite rock twice in the first year after I left. Once in April, when the ice was just off the creek and the light came through the gap in the canopy the way it always had. Once in early December, the first real snow, when the bank was white and the water was dark, and the rock sat in the bend of the creek the way it had always sat, indifferent, patient, unchanged. Both times I brought one of the pine knots in my coat pocket. Both times I sat on the bank for an hour. Both times I left nothing on the rock and took nothing away, because there was nothing left to leave and nothing left to take. And the transaction we had conducted on that bank for 9 years was complete. The rock did not need my additions to be what it was. It had been there before us, and it would be there after. It held nothing, and kept nothing, and owed me nothing, and that was the most honest thing in 43,000 acres of forest that I had spent 19 years watching and 9 years lying about. I have not been back since the December visit. My knees will not carry me 4 miles from the truck on uneven terrain anymore. My heart, as my cardiologist has made increasingly clear, does not need the exertion. I am 67 years old, and I am sitting at a kitchen table in a house in Mercer, Wisconsin, with a coffee tin on the windowsill and 2 pine knots in front of me, and I am telling you this because no one else on earth knows the full shape of it. Not Hargrove, not the department, not the researchers and the internet forums and the podcasters who are so certain they know what lives in those northern forests. They do not know what I know. What I know is not dramatic in the way they want it to be. It is not a monster. It is not a hoax. It is not evidence or proof or a case to be made. What I know is the sound of Miriam singing into a February sky at -14 degrees. What I know is the weight of Ezra at 43 pounds in a wool blanket on my truck seat, breathing. What I know is the amber catch of a stranger's eyes at the tree line in the June evening light, looking at me without fear or malice, looking at me with something that felt like recognition of something I could not name. What I know is that I put my hand on the top of a creature's head between its ears, and it allowed it, briefly, and then it walked into the trees and did not look back. And I have been standing at the tree line ever since, watching the place where it disappeared, understanding that this is not a loss you carry in the ordinary sense. You do not carry it the way you carry grief or failure or regret. You carry it the way you carry the specific shape of something irreplaceable. Not its absence, its shape. The exact and particular dimensions of what it was. The cold earth smell. The amber eyes. the pine knot placed with deliberate precision at the center of a granite rock in the morning light, by something that had no reason to offer that gesture and offered it anyway, again and again, for 9 years. That is what it cost me to understand. That being witnessed, fully and without condition, by something that had every reason not to trust you, is the rarest thing this world contains. It does not need to last, it does not need to stay. Its weight is not diminished by its ending. If anything, the ending is what made it exact, made it something I could hold in both hands and know the dimensions of completely. A pine knot from a white pine. Amber at the grain spiral. Dense and resinous, and always in the process of becoming something. I set it on the table every morning when I make my coffee. I will set it there tomorrow. I will set it there until there is no more tomorrow. And every morning it will mean the same thing. It meant the first time she placed it on the rock and stepped back. That she had seen me, and that it was enough.